Hello, podcast listeners. I'm Steve Gilly, along with Rod Mullins, and today we're bringing you the fascinating story of one of Pikeville, Kentucky's most remarkable natives, another one of the stories of Appalachia.
We've actually told this story before, Steve, but we've had a listener who enjoys our podcasts and also got with us and told us, there's some things that you're kind of leaving out about this, or some things that have kind of been, I don't know, a little bit more emphasized or overemphasized about things. But I first found out about John Paul Riddle at a place called BitSource in Pikeville, Kentucky. And a guy there was, they had some things up on the wall of all these famous Appalachians. And I was like, well, who's that? And he said, don't you know who that is? That's John Paul Riddle. He would go and he would barnstorm and he would fly underneath the old Pikeville Bridge here. And I was like, first I've ever heard about it. Then I started doing some research and found out a lot about him. And then we did the story, of course, like what I'm already telling you. But thanks to a listener, she's got it to where she's at least helping us kind of set the record straight, so to speak.
Yeah, this listener was actually doing some research for a project that they have about John Paul Riddle and had noticed a couple of inaccuracies, which really wasn't us. It's just the sources we got. And I asked her if she'd kind of take a look at the script. She did, and gave us some other information as well. So we certainly appreciate that. And Rod, I guess without any further ado, let's get into this very fascinating story about a very fascinating man.
Okay.
Now, folks, our story begins on May 19th, 1901, with the birth of John Paul Riddle in Pikeville, Kentucky, a town famously tied to the Hatfield-McCoy feud. But John's story goes far beyond the hills of Appalachia. Growing up in Pikeville, young Riddle was captivated by the burgeoning field of aviation. Born during the era of the Wright brothers' historic flight, he was inspired by the endless possibilities that flight presented. And this spark, Rod, led him on a path to become a pioneer in aviation.
Well, just 17 years after the Wright brothers' flight, John attended Pikeville College, now known as the University of Pikeville, where he graduated and married Adele Gosser. He then had a brief stint in the U.S. Army Air Corps, where he earned his wings and embarked on a thrilling career as a daredevil barnstormer. Well, then from 1920 to 1922, Riddle attended mechanic school at Kelly Field in Texas, then moved on to Chanute Field in Illinois, and then on to flying school at Carlstrom Field. His budding aviation career next took him to Post Field in Oklahoma, where he learned the importance of solid aircraft construction. Well, after leaving the Army Air Corps, he dived into the world of barnstorming, those fearless aviators who performed daring stunts and offered joyrides. Now, you're going to probably wonder, how did he come up with his own plane? Well, we're getting ready to tell you how, okay? Back after World War I, they had a surplus of these planes, Curtiss Jenny planes. And so flying for him was flying a $250 Curtiss Jenny aircraft. Now, that was back in those days. Steve, what would that translate out to being right now?
A whole lot more.
Yeah, I noticed you avoided the math question on that one real good, but yeah, it would be a whole lot more. But Riddle would go and fly his Curtiss Jenny and would give a ride to passengers for just a few dollars, letting them share in his love of aviation. Riddle crisscrossed a dozen states, thrilling crowds and earning a name for himself, and by 1923, he was doing some amazing things with his airplane, like flying under the old Middle Bridge in Pikeville, like I told you about at the beginning of this podcast, as he was barnstorming throughout eastern Kentucky and Ohio.
Well, Rod, you mentioned barnstorming. That became one of the most popular forms of entertainment in the early 20th century. Pilots like Riddle and others turned their passion into a spectacle, captivating audiences with aerial feats. They'd perform stunts featuring any trick or feat with an airplane that people could imagine. And barnstorming became one of the most popular forms of entertainment. It was one of the first forms of civil aviation in the history of flight, and a lot of the pilots, learned their chops doing these tricks. Now, one of the things that made barnstorming possible for Riddle and other men at the time, such as Von Shores, who was another self-taught barnstorming pilot, and yes, illegal whiskey transporter during Prohibition, was that surplus of Curtiss Jenny biplanes that Rod told you about. Now, those biplanes, flown during World War I, weren't needed anymore by the U.S. military. So the government decided that'd be a good idea to sell them off, and we'll get what we can out of them, as little as $200 apiece. For the low, low price of $200, though, those airplanes didn't come in one piece. They had to be put back together, which cost a lot more than $200. But for pilots like Shores and John Riddle, that cost didn't matter so long as they could soar through the sky. Now, those pilots recouped those costs from folks who wanted to watch them flying as much as they themselves wanted to fly. On any given day, a pilot or team of pilots would fly over a small town and attract the attention of the local folks. He and his team of aviators and mechanics would then land at a local farm near the barn, hence the name barnstorming. There they would negotiate with the farmer for the use of one of his fields as a temporary runway from which to stage an air show and offer airplane rides to customers, for a fee, of course. After obtaining that base of operations, the aviators would fly back over the town and drop handbills, offering airplane rides for anywhere from $1 to $5. And Rod, pilots could make terrific money for a day's work, couldn't they?
Yeah, they could. Well, here's a story about one occasion involving John Paul Riddle. Riddle was flying from Pikeville to Cincinnati on a one-day excursion when he ran out of gas and he landed in a field. Well, once down on the ground, he instantly attracted this curious crowd of onlookers who came up I guess they'd never seen a plane before. They were looking at it and amazed by the whole thing. Well, after he refueled, he started taking folks up for rides, and he made a quick $150 because he had to gas up his plane. Smart man. Well, for many in Appalachia, it was a chance to see an airplane up close and be thrilled and experience flying. For many rural towns, the appearance of a barnstormer on the horizon was like the circus coming to town or a national holiday, as almost everything in town would shut down so folks could ride the plane and watch the show. Well, eventually, for John Paul Riddle, while barnstorming in Kentucky was nice, the neighboring state of Ohio proved to be a bit more attractive because of the big open fields and many places to land. Mr. Riddle made a move to Cincinnati in 1925, and it was at one of his appearances in Ohio that a man by the name of Talton Higby Embry, the heir of a wealthy stockyard owner, took a ride in John Riddle's airplane. Well, the two hit it off. They became friends, and that friendship turned into a very, very profitable relationship.
It did indeed. By 1925, Riddle partnered with Embry to found the Embry-Riddle Flying School at Lunken Airport in Cincinnati. Two of John Paul Riddle's early students at the school were Hig Embry himself, along with his mother, soon followed by many others. In the early days, though, tuitions didn't cover all the costs of the school, so to help make the money needed to keep the planes in the air, the flying school would hold air circuses every Saturday, kind of like the barnstorming stuff, keeping up that tradition with stunts, parachute jumps, and appearances from well-known pilots like Jimmy Doolittle, who would thrill the crowds below with high-speed flyovers. In 1927, the school won one of the first federal airmail contracts, and the company was incorporated 2 years later as part of the Aviation Corporation of Delaware, later known as Avco. That company, in turn, gave birth to American Airways, known today as American Airlines. And the flying school itself, well, it was shut down in 1930.
Well, John Paul Riddle and T. Higby Embry parted ways, with Embry moving on to California. Riddle kept the school name, and in 1934, he opened up a charter seaplane service in Miami. He, along with John and Isabel McKay, reestablished the school at Miami Municipal Airport in 1939. At the start of World War II, Embry-Riddle made valuable contributions to the war effort by training over 25,000 U.S. and British servicemen on how to fly and maintain military aircraft, all while operating 3 schools in Florida and 1 in Tennessee. Riddle took his flying service in school international in 1943 as he opened the technical school of aviation for the Brazilian Air Ministry in Sao Paulo. And in 1946, he began training civilians at the Riddle Inter-American Institute. The school was moved to Daytona Beach in 1965, and it officially became a university, Embry-Riddle Aeronautical University, in 1970. It now has campuses in Daytona Beach and Prescott, Arizona.
John Paul Riddle, the man from eastern Kentucky, went on to meet many famous people around the world. He globetrotted with billionaire and aviation buff Howard Hughes, who built the famous wooden Spruce Goose. He dined with the Prince of Wales, now King Charles III of the United Kingdom. And speaking of which, this man from Pikeville earned the thanks of said United Kingdom in 1947 when he was honored as a member of the British Empire in recognition of his service in training Royal Air Force cadets during World War II. There's even a historical marker, number 2251 in Pikeville, that notes the numerous contributions made to aviation by early airman John Paul Riddle. And he's also remembered, along with his RAF cadets, with a marker at Oak Ridge Cemetery in Arcadia, Florida. Riddle retired from all this fun in the early 1960s and passed away on April 6, 1989, in Coral Gables, Florida, after a brief illness.
Here's some other notable information about the Embry-Riddle School. Greg Faith, a retired NTSC investigator, went to school there, along with Scott O'Grady, the pilot who was shot down in 1995 over Bosnia-Herzegovina and survived for a week before being rescued. Embry-Riddle is also the alma mater of 10 astronauts from NASA and commercial space companies. Now, it was rumored that the institution trained the 9/11 hijackers, but this has since been debunked. However, graduate David Charlesbaugh was the first officer on American Airlines Flight 77, which crashed into the Pentagon on September 11th, 2001. And, of all things, John Paul Riddle is related to both the Hatfields and McCoys, although there are likely a bunch of folks there who can claim the same thing with him.
Wow. Yeah, that he's from Pikeville, I guess. Yeah, he's probably kin to either a Hatfield or a McCoy or both, just like we said.
Wow. What else can you say about it?
Well, a very interesting man, and a very interesting story. I mean, just imagine nowadays if you had the chance for what would be the equivalent, like your own personal spaceship, like NASA sold spaceships and at discount prices, and so you took people up into orbit, something like that. That's how wild that would have sounded back in the 1920s, don't you think?
Yeah. Well, I mean, hey, we could talk about some of those people all day that's, doesn't have anything else better to do with their money but to send up ships up into the atmosphere and then, blow them up after they're finished with them, but at least land 2 stages. I'm not going to mention any names, but some of these people, that's what they're doing. That's just kind of their own personal playground, but it's not exactly the same thing as sitting in the cockpit and taking off and doing this stuff all on your own like John Paul Riddle did. And I just love that story about, hearing about him buzzing and going underneath the Middle River Bridge there in Pikeville, and then just, doing a loop, coming back around and stuff, and having, I was told at one time, wing walkers. They had wing walkers and people like that. That was all a part of this barnstorming and this air circus that they sort of had. But, just a fascinating look at a man that I think some people don't realize, but he came from Appalachia.
Yeah, a homegrown aviator. And you're right about that wing walking. Pilots would actually climb out of the cockpit, strap their feet into the wings, and then as the plane did a barrel roll, they just kind of stand there, sometimes with their arms just folded like, oh, this ain't nothing.
We also mentioned, I'll close out with this, we also mentioned Vaughn Shores in this. And if you're not familiar with Vaughn Shores Von Shores, as we mentioned in the podcast early on, he was one of these aviators that did the same thing that John Paul Riddle did and got a hold of a Curtiss Jenny plane, learned to put it all together. He did a lot of the same things. But like you mentioned, though, Steve, he was one of these people that, used his for a little bit of a different kind of enterprise, sort of than what John Paul Riddle was using his airplane and so forth. But here is the deal. Both of them contributed to the war effort because Von Shores, I think, went to Tampa, and then he trained a bunch of pilots there, mainly just a lot of these things of, barrel rolls, how to get out of things, how to get out of these certain situations. He was teaching them things that was kind of on the edge, whereas John Paul Riddle and, the school was teaching these pilots things of basic aircraft knowledge, how far it can go, what you can do with it. Here, Von Shores was teaching them things that helped them in the war effort and made these people a lot more knowledgeable and also much more successful in the war effort.
And folks, that's the story of Pikeville native John Paul Riddle, another one of the stories of Appalachia. Thanks for listening. Till next we meet, y'all take care. So long, everybody.